Hello and welcome to PM Express inside the Accra International Conference Center at the Pan-African Conference of Inequities in the context of structural transformation. Now, one will say, what is that? Now, with me to explain what it is and why it's going on, from my far left is Professor Bartholomew Ama, who is the Chief Renewal of Planning of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And then to my immediate right is Senator Bilo Kero, who's from Kenya. And he is the chairman for the Finance, Commerce and Economic Affairs Committee. So these guys can talk Africa. Welcome.
Thank you.
Prof, let me start with you. Chief Renewal of Planning, just briefly. I mean,
Well, it's about renewing Africa's appetite for planning, basically.
Okay.
Development planning. So it's really about ensuring that Africa positions itself in terms of development within the context of the development plans. Of course, you probably heard the saying, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail.
That's it.
So it's really in that context. And planning, of course, you know, in the 60s, most African countries were doing development plans. Then we had structural adjustment period where that whole process fizzled, and when we went into a more of a liberal market-oriented approach to development. We know the story about that, and then we came to PRSP kind of planning, which I would call quasi-planning era of Africa. But currently, countries are now mutating or evolving from PRSP-based planning to long-term plans with medium-term roadmaps that lead to that long-term plan. So ECA, in the spirit of trying to support African countries in that planning process, recently instituted this new section, which is part of what is called the Macroeconomic Policy Division.
Okay. Well, that's good. Now, there's a lot of planning that we have to talk about, but let me move on to Senator. And Senator, my question is, will this African generation realize that African dream, or are we just going to lay a foundation and maybe future generation will inherit it?
I think it's, in this day and age, it is good to be optimistic that we will be able to realize our dreams. I always believe that positive thinking will work, in the sense that times have changed in Africa. There is increasing democratization across the continent. There is increasing demand for accountability by leaders, which is changing the governance paradigm, all that across the regions. So, coupled with the fact that there is the change in technological transformation has really improved communication. I think the push for accountability would and the increasing focus on exploitation of resources within our regions, value additions in what the countries are trying to do, and generally increasing growth in the economies. I am hopeful that the next 50 years will not be the same as the 50 years that have gone by. So I'm hopeful that within our generation we will see change in the direction of some of the things that we're talking about.
Good. Let me come to Prof. Prof, today's meeting, Pan-African Conference on Inequalities and the Context of Structural Transformation. Although it speaks for itself, but what is the meeting trying to achieve?
Well, it is trying to marry this whole idea that Africa needs to stop exporting jobs through the export of raw materials and really create a more inclusive development trajectory. That is, ensure that more people are part of the development process. And by doing so, we carry more people out of poverty, narrow the income gaps. Now let's step back again and see where this is all coming from. In the past decade or so, African countries have been growing quite rapidly. And in the media, there's a whole talk about Africa rising. Before, Africa was a hopeless continent.
Mm-hmm.
So this positive story has really been touted in the media. But if you look at some of the social indicators, poverty levels, health, maternal mortality, high levels of maternal mortality, school dropout rates, you see that the economic growth story has not been matched by the social development story. So African countries have then begun to reflect on how do you leverage this growth process to ensure that it is more inclusive. Now, not because, for two reasons. Well, inclusiveness has a moral imperative. One has to ensure that one's people bear the fruits of that development process. But secondly, for sustainability of the growth process. You know that Africa has a very large youthful, the youth bulge is large. Mm-hmm. A lot of youth who are unemployed. Now, if you're growing and telling people that your growth rates are 5%, 6%, 7%, and only a few people are getting these jobs, what do you think is going to happen over the long term? The young people are going to get restless, mm-hmm. and we've seen in different parts of the continent and the world, this can have some social unrest implications. So growth has to have the imperative of being inclusive and bringing more people in the process. And so structural transformation is really about moving from low productivity activities like agriculture into more high productivity activities, including manufacturing. If you look at the data for Africa, we find that agricultural share of GDP is going down, service share is going up. However, the kind of jobs that are generated in both sectors are not sufficient of adequate quality to really bring the masses out. So manufacturing, as part of this whole idea of structural transformation, has been touted as a way to create more jobs. How? Take, for example, the cocoa that we produce. Mm-hmm. If we were able to process it. Okay? So you have people who are processing it. It involves people who are going to be part of that process. When you process it, there are certain services and logistics that are required to complete the whole process of turning that cocoa into whatever end product you have. So basically, agriculture, manufacturing links the agriculture and the service sector in a value chain of employment opportunities and livelihoods. Now, of course, to produce something implies that you can sell it at a competitive price. Mm-hmm. So this whole transformation agenda has to be coupled with a people-centered or commensurate efforts to build the productivity, strengthen the productivity of people, which means health and education are areas that we need to invest in. Now, as we reap gains from the sale of these primary commodities, the oil, the gold, if we reinvest those resources in human capital development and also in this structural transformation agenda, we believe that our whole growth trajectory will be more sustainable over time. So it's about sustainability, getting more people involved in the development process, and ensuring that the continent really benefits from its natural resources, which are some of which can be depletable. You're not going to have oil forever, the gold forever. So,
Senator, so I come back to you, and I'm sure it's because you mentioned democracy. And we run a democracy where it's very, very expensive to come into government by the time you campaign and the posters and everything. But then you have 4 years sort of guaranteed before you start campaigning again. You have a mass, general public who want to see what you did. So within 4 years, you tend to find out that schools are springing up, street lights, boreholes. So that long-term goals that bring this chain from the agric it takes longer than the 4-year plan. And if you went to your electorate and tell them, look, I put the plan in place, it's going to mature in 8 years' time, they vote you out. So I think, you are then tied to focus on short-term goals rather than long-term goals. How are you going to overcome this challenge?
Yeah, it's they say democracy is not cheap, but I think the focus is to move towards participatory democracy, where public participation becomes key, and where programs and projects and activities of development are really owned by the people, by the nation, and not really something that has happened in the past through a top-down approach by the government of the day that comes into power. What that would mean is that then there are development paradigms that would be different from the ones we had before, where you develop, you drop your development blueprint for medium to long term. And governments, whichever government that comes to power, really, at the end of the day, has to be committed to that development blueprint, because that's the national vision that the country has set for itself in the next 10, 15 years. That's what it wants to achieve. That's the direction it wants to go. So governments coming in would not, therefore, just want to change. And in that regard, I think your contribution for the period that you are in office, whichever government, it can be measured in terms of the progress towards that goal, progress towards that activity. I think that's the way to do it. But the most important thing being, it has to be public participation, really, in the planning. And this is the point about inclusiveness that Professor has mentioned. I think that's the way to go to address that concern. Otherwise, I agree with you. If that's not done, then I will be concerned about the 4 years, and so you look at short-term projects, and that would really mean we'll have lost an opportunity. So I think that is the way. I think in Kenya, we have what we call Vision 2030, and many countries, looking at 10, 20 years horizon, really, to try and achieve certain significant development programs, particularly in infrastructure, large infrastructure projects, and others that are designed to achieve economic development.
Prof, I think you have a very peculiar position, a very important position. Is there a way of doing an education revolution where the average African is taught to be African again? Because there's a great percentage of the people on the continent who are very, very westernized in their religion, in their language, in their thinking, in their beliefs, are very, very westernized, and they would look down on themselves. Is there any way we can retrain people deliberately to become Africans so that we love and maintain what is us? Otherwise, we would forever be happy to get rid of our resources and just give me the money so I can live like a European.
As I've grown more gray hairs, I've come to realize that development is not just about economics. It's also about culture and attitudes. And attitudes, it's all about mental, social engineering. And so you can be technically sound in terms of your science and technology and all that, but where your mind is in terms of your inclination will determine how dedicated you are to serving based on those skills. So the point I'm making is that there are two levels. First, social engineering, maybe through schools. We used to have these civic education programs to get people to really love their countries. I've had the benefit of living in Ethiopia, and I think it's one of the countries where people are they really love their countries. Even when they go out, they recreate their countries, their societies outside. And it may have something to do with their long history of not being colonized or whatever. But so that there's a level of that social engineering through formal education, maybe also through maybe formal and informal systems. But there is also the need to reinforce that through concrete, visible results. In other words, if you've been socialized into believing that your country is great, that you should love the country, but then for years and years you do not see any positive developments, then that mental and cultural identity can be easily eroded over time. I think that we all love our countries, but you know, different experiences, some people have been forced to go outside and all that, and so that can also erode that. But I think what we need to do is really go back to basics and really begin this whole process of social engineering. And I think that if it is done right, you know, it can also help to inculcate and nurture a cadre of leaders that would look out for the interests of the country. We always talk about the fact that we do not have good leaders. We do not have good leaders. But I don't think good leaders fall out of the sky. Occasionally you may get a very good one, but I think that to get a system that produces good leaders requires some kind of planning. And part of that is really this whole social engineering, but it has to be backed up by results. I think over time, as you get good leaders who begin to really to show results, it can then create the belief, it will then reinforce the belief that, you know, this country is good, it's a good place to serve and to sacrifice. So you need to look at it from both social engineering and also action in terms of the results of the leaders, in terms of what they do, how they act on what they do, not just simply rhetoric.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a break here, and when I come back, I'm going to Senator. And since he's part of the finance and commerce and economics, why we don't sort of deliberately empower local businesses to grow, to become giants, and we're always quick to go to the next foreign contractor or next foreign business to come in, and then we get our local guys to support, and they will forever play in support roles. When are we going to flip the coin? Stay tuned. Well, welcome back to this very exciting conversation, if I may say it. It's a conference called Pan-African Conference on Inequalities in the Context of Structural Transformation. And I met up with two lovely gentlemen, and we are talking Africa. Just before we went on the break, I was just wanting to find out from Senator. Funny enough, I don't know if it's a Kenya problem, but it's a Ghana problem, where instead of saying, calling 6 road contractors to say, listen, put your heads together, take this money and do the road. They say, oh no, he hasn't got the capacity to do it. So we bring somebody in from Japan or from Israel to come and do the road. Sometimes the funding is local funding. You can understand if they came with their own funding, your arms are tied. But if it's local funding, then you expect that, look, get 6 contractors, work them together and do what's stopping us from getting into that habit?
First, let me also share your concern. It's the same problem, I think, challenge we face in Kenya and many other countries in the region. For a long time, our countries, I think our governments, have been beholden to foreign, everything foreign, foreign contractors, foreign consultants. Literally, ideas were being outsourced to the point where even imports of basic goods and services. I remember when we liberalized several years ago, we ended up in Kenya getting even eggs and tomatoes being imported from South Africa and other places. Really to that point. But the two issues really on that you raised are fundamental, and we've been discussing in the context of the inequalities in Africa. One is there has been a general failure, policy failure, if you will, policy influenced by our politics really, a failure to acknowledge that nearly 80%, at least in Kenya, of our employment, if you will, is through the informal sector, what we call the small and micro enterprises, the farmers, agriculture, and those are the areas that employ really that nearly profits of our people. But all those SMEs or our local companies that we've established, small to medium-sized enterprises, have literally stagnated at that level for many years, for the simple reason that one, they cannot access credit. Two, if they access credit, the credit will be expensive, and it becomes difficult for them, therefore, to expand their business. And then, in terms of policy, specific, public policy that requires that any significant major, project or activity or contract or infrastructure has to be given to big companies that are from outside, foreign companies. So for a long time, that has been the key challenge that really denied our companies the opportunity to grow and to compete. So what we have coming up with, I think that realization is there, and I think it's some of the issues that we've been discussing even in this conference, that our governments need to make a deliberate effort, really, to address the inequalities, particularly in the context of access to finance, which is a major challenge. In countries like Kenya now, what we microfinance institutions would target this kind of medium to small size, because have really grown to a large extent, and they are now regulated at the central bank level because of their, and most of them have grown to, grown big, and therefore investing and supporting companies really in that range. Second, I think what we have also seen in present years is the government, through a deliberate policy, has specifically provided that all government contracts, public sector contracts, about 1/3 or 30% must be given to that class of the citizens who have suffered inequalities most. These are the women, the youth, persons with disabilities, and these marginalized groups. And 30%, you must, every institution or state corporation or government institution must provide for that in terms of their procurement. But I think, of course, there is also the move in some countries. I think Kenya could have seen in recent years, Zambia, a number of countries, where at least a requirement that 30% of all their contracts must be actually for local companies. You cannot just give 100% of all the activities you have. But I agree with you that that's one of the areas in which the challenge. But I think the concern has been because of the pressure from multilateral institutions that have been providing funding, who have claimed over the years that they have to have, institutions, companies. One, because the donor requirement is that it must be a company from EU or from America for them to implement a particular program. And two, who also think that only those companies that are registered in their countries, contracted as contractors in their countries, are able to execute certain level of the projects. I think so. It has been part of the requirements, but what is changing actually in Kenya now is that if it's a fully government-funded project, to a large extent, I think it's becoming common to see companies that are coming together, even as consortiums, to carry the projects. I think that's critical.
That's important. Prof, one thing that, as an African, I tend to see and cuts across is that we hope to have a good governance and hope that at the end of the day we have a good country. We don't deliberately say that, no, we need to do this in order to achieve that. So let us take 200 people and train them as dentists, so we have 200 dentists. We just hope that, let them take them to schools, and by all means some dentists will come out at the end of it. We don't deliberately look at the state and say, listen, we are really falling short of this, and therefore get me 1,000 guys, I'm going to train them into this so that I have that quality. So what happens is, even if the foreign donor or foreign guy comes in with his money, say I'm coming to build a road, now get me steel benders. We don't even have the steel benders. So he then has to go back to wherever he comes from to bring steel benders. And then you realize that out of the 1 million he brought into the state, apart from the fuel he buys and a few other things, all the money goes back. We are not very good at deliberately positioning ourselves, right?
Well, yeah, it comes back to the issue of planning and how we identify our priorities and act on it. I think, you know, I was lucky to be part of the process of the creation of the Ghana first poverty reduction strategy and then the second one. I mean, these were well thought out strategies with a lot of priorities identified in them. But you see, I've come to believe that it's the policy crafting is the easy part. That is the technical part. The whole challenge of development is not just an economic one, it's a political economy issue. Because you're talking really about prioritizing and also about the capacity to deliver in terms of going from the idea to the execution of the idea and how well it is done. So I think we need to really think about how do we ensure that we act on our priorities and that we actually deliver. And I think in the delivery, while we talk about the leadership, at the middle level, that's an area where we also need to really have those capacities, because they are the ones that actually are critical in terms of the implementation. You may have a policy on paper that says X, Y, Z, but then when it comes to implementation, you don't have that the capacity. But part of that capacity, for me, is also about, do people know about these policies? Because if, for example, you have stipulated that it should take only so many steps to clear your goods from the port, but then if I, as a businessman, I'm trying to do it and I'm not aware, or these stipulations are not clear to me, I don't know my rights, I don't know what my rights are in terms of how do I ensure that what the law says is acted upon. So it also comes down to issues of monitoring the implementation of these policies and ensuring that whatever you find out in terms of monitoring is acted upon. The whole idea of monitoring and evaluation is really a new concept in most of these countries. It came, although we had institutions that were supposed to do that, it was during the PRSP era that we set up these monitoring systems. But you also find that after putting a lot of effort in writing these reports, the feedback from the report to the policy changes that are required, that are called for in those reports, that link is also sometimes weak. So really, I think at the end of the day, we need to have a very strong civil society that knows what's going on and is able to put pressure on policymakers to ensure that corrective action, the policies are actually implemented and there's corrective action. So those institutions, so it comes down to institutional weaknesses. That's where we have problems in terms of implementation. And when institutions are weak, where are the pressure points to enforce and get people to act and to work?
Prof, I want to stay with you. So you draft all these policies, and it's all well and good. Let me know what my rights are when I get to clear the ports, and things go wrong. However, you see, we've made our politics so divisive that the only people who demand accountability are people who support the government in opposition. Because if you are supporting the government in power and you complain, it's like you're embarrassing them. This is my part of the family. Let me hush. And then if your party then comes to the power, you then keep quiet. You don't want to complain about the system again. So it makes accountability. You're even embarrassed to demand accountability because everybody then knows, there you go, he's in opposition because he's complaining about the system. So how do we move past that?
Well, that's a very important point you raise. I mean, people locking into certain political strands and overlooking, and that really weakens the ability to critique constructively policies of government. And I think one way to get around that is to have some of these opportunities for constructive criticism be anonymous. You have institutions where you have boxes where you put in your suggestion boxes. Now, of course, whatever happens to those suggestions is another issue. But one thing that the government of Ethiopia did when it was doing its road construction is that it would give the road construction to the Chinese and give the monitoring to the Germans. So you have a separate entity that is really whose interests are outside. In fact, who may even have a better interest in not
what you're doing.
Yes.
Make sure you do it.
So we need to think about how do we create these entities that have an interest to do their job.
Yeah.
For example,
police each other.
Yeah, and even in the Western countries, you have within the police you have a unit within it that is called internal affairs that monitors the police doing their work. So I think we need to think about how we establish our institutions and incentive structures, because people at the end of the day respond to incentives. What is it in it for them, or what do they lose by speaking out or not speaking out?
Let me come to something. Zanita, another thing that really, and I think if we find a silver bullet to it, we will be, it's just trading among each other. Ghana supplying Togo, Togo supplying Benin, Nigeria buying salt from Ghana, we buy kola nuts from them, whatever it is. If we are able to achieve that, but we don't trust each other, even to just travel through our borders, let alone go and trade, then we have the language also. But how are we going to go past it? Because that is that silver bullet that would make or break us.
Yes, I think the intra-Africa trade has, the reasons in my view is two really. One, it's colonial, it's designed. It was designed deliberately that you don't trade amongst yourself, or rather you don't even share everything as a continent. That's the point that was being raised earlier. You have to fly to Europe to get to a country in the second, I think, was also the politics in our own countries, the mistrust, the perception that you mentioned earlier. People still having that, seed mentality. Still, everything in their mind is Europe and America and those countries. And you don't really think there's anything good in Africa. That because of the persistent stories you've been reading from the time you're in school, you're told this is a dark continent, this is a hopeless place, and so you always, that has been it's historical, I think. Second, I think so what is happening now is there are deliberate efforts to try and open up Africa. In fact, we have realized that there is much more business opportunities within Africa than in fact outside. This is the part of the structural transformation we are talking about is build domestic demand in your countries, in your neighboring countries, and focus on integration and look for markets around here really, than to rely on those exports to those countries, because export-driven economies which are focused on natural resources have not been able to change our lives, over a long period of time. And some of the things you were discussing today, and some ideas for saying why must you be on that mentality that you must grow cocoa only and sell it to Europe? Can't you do anything else? You can. But because you've been told this, you've never been thinking also. This is the structural transformation we want. We want people to think outside the box, really completely. We need a new shift in the way we look at each other. And this is why in East Africa, for example, in Kenya now, the largest trading partner for Kenya is Uganda. And the second one is the other countries like Tanzania and Rwanda and so forth. Gradually we find that it's better doing business really, and much more volumes than in those countries than to struggle for quotas and for tariff,
for visas,
and all those challenges of meeting the requirements of export to Europe or Western countries. And I think so. We have not really been open up to each other, and the politics is what needs to change. Our leadership has been the failure. I think the leadership in Africa really, they have never sat to, with all due respect to, you're not in Addis East yet, but I think the point is, I think African Union countries need to focus on building confidence among themselves, really, and encouraging integration, encouraging infrastructures that open up this whole continent to each other. I think this is something that has been lacking, and this is where we need statesmanship in Africa, really, so that Africans can focus on themselves and not be dependent. Because for a long time, because of the nature of...
Can the AU, I don't know if it's a sanction or convention, say that, listen, within the next 3 years, you should be trading with at least 5 African countries. You must have X amount of business with 5 African countries, so that everybody goes home and says, listen guys, by the next meeting we need to be trading with this. Either we're buying meat from Niger and we are giving them, you know, maize, or we're buying millets from him and he's giving us milk. Because there are so many things in which we bring from Europe that are in African countries, you know. And one example is that Nigeria buys salt from Brazil, and all the West African coast. Ghana is positioned that they can, you know, harvest salt. Yet we don't even give them an ounce of salt. I mean, can the AU come up and say, look, guys, you need to trade with at least 2 or 3 African countries before our next meeting? I don't know.
They can. Once we cease to be dependent on foreign aid, that's critical. Because when you're dependent on aid, you don't have the freedom to do what you want to do. Second, if we get that leadership, for a long time, the leadership we've had in many of our countries really are people who have been puppets to Western, interests or other interests, where corruption and kickbacks and many things really determine your policies. But I think if that's changing, if the governance paradigms change in most of these countries, then, and we are less dependent on aid, because aid comes with its conditions and so forth, I think then that opportunity will come, and I think this is the direction. This is the only way. What Africa needs today is actually trade. And the most important market is Africa itself, your neighbors, your own people. Create demand in your own country. Go to the countries that are your neighbors. You don't even need to look out.
Senator, thank you very much. Folks, we're going to go for the break, and then when we come back, we want to find out. Kwame Nkrumah mentioned this many years ago and was jumping up and down. What took us so long? Stay tuned. Well, hello and welcome back, and there's a little bit of flavor added into our guest lineup now. So now I have Professor Techua Menu, who is the Director of Social Development, the Policy Division on the United Nations. So
Economic Commission for Africa.
Economic Commission for Africa. And as we're here, obviously, she's very well versed on the subject. Prof, since you just joined, I will start with you.
Yes.
Prof, one thing which, maybe it's my personal thing, but the more intelligent people you have in a country or in a society, the wealthier they become, because it's one of the most important resource anybody can have. It's the human brain.
Yes.
And from where you are coming from, is there a deliberate effort to revolutionize our thinking so as to become wealthy as a continent? More education, more science and technology, so we can, convert our resources into things that make us wealthy.
Thank you. Well, I'll say that on paper, nobody would disagree with you. If you look either in our, let's say if we're talking about Ghana, if you look at the constitution, the provisions about, progressively extending education to the population. If you look at the African Union Commission, the Africa 2063 document, the science, technology and innovation policy, nobody would disagree with you. I think the problem with us, both as a country and as a continent, is not the difficulty with elaborating policies. It's really about seeing those policies through, implementing them. And in this conference there has been, yesterday there was a presentation from UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which has done a lot of reviews of countries and their success around the world, especially in East Asia and other places. And they made the point that what distinguishes countries is about the formulation of appropriate policies and about continuity in policies, and also about some flexibility that, you know, even when you have a policy, you cannot be rigid about it, that there should be room for experimentation. So certainly in our case, I mean, you know, last month, Bart and I were in Abuja for the ECA's Conference of Ministers, and there was in the experts segment, the representative from Mauritius. His point was that Mauritius has no natural resources, only its people. And yet, he showed how they had moved from a GDP of 240, almost 40 years ago, to a GDP of $18,000 now. And it is because they invested heavily in their people. So, as for education, it trumps everything. Huh? It trumps ignorance. I think we have a proverb in Chi about how, you know, if they put money and education there, you should take education, and that you can get the money to come and later to come and redeem things. But education has to be meaningful. When we talk about education, we don't just mean enrollment. We just don't mean putting children in school. Earlier on this year, just before I left for Addis Ababa, I believe, in January, there was a report that worried me very much. The Ministry of Education and USAID, they were doing a review of competencies in our public schools. And they found out, I mean, the figure was so huge, like more than 50% of children up to a certain level, they could not read in English or in any Ghanaian language. Then they had another large proportion which could read, but could not understand what they read. And it was only a very small proportion who could both read and understand, which means that we're throwing away resources, you know. So I think that we need to take, number one, we need to take education seriously, the quality of education. We need to take it seriously. And then this issue of science, technology, and innovation. Again, the UNIDO presentation was talking about innovation and how it actually increases productivity and everything. So I think that we pay lip service to these things, and until we really concretize it and put our money where our mouth is, I'm afraid that we'll be joking, and we will continue both to be poor and also to widen the inequalities in our society.
So, well, there are two professors, so Professor Menu, let me stay with you. Are we able to be frank with ourselves like this? Because I find sometimes because of the beauty of English language, we choose the language and we dance around the thing. But are we able to sit down and say, listen, smell the coffee, it's too late, we need to get up and go now? Are we able to say to ourselves?
This report in the media, I mean, it was open. I didn't, you know, it was reported in the newspapers. So certainly the report was available for those who chose, who choose to see it. The problem really is the accountability. When these things happen, who do we hold to account? How do we hold people to account? Because also I think as a country, we have become too fascinated with, let's say, the Public Accounts Committee of Parliament, which is important, but we spend a lot of time trying to find out who has spent or overspent or misspent money here. But we do not track progress. You know, the NDPC publishes this annual progress report, which is supposed to show how different sectors have performed relative to the targets that they themselves set. There is never a national debate on that. It is not presented to Parliament, you know. So it seems to me that until we improve our accountability and people know that they cannot go on as usual, that they have to answer for some way. You know, there are countries where when one woman dies in childbirth, they hold an audit, a maternal audit, a mortality audit, to find out what happened. But when you have countries where as many women die as recently as in a month or something, like the number of people who just disappeared on the Malaysian jet and nobody says anything, it just goes on. Oh, sorry, pity, you know, but nothing happens. So every year the maternal mortality rate keeps counting, and all of this is a question of accountability. Who is accountable to whom for what?
Professor Sama, with the statistics that Professor Ticho is giving us, the number of people who can read, write, and understand. That's all you have got to implement your planning, So after you've come out with all these elaborate plans, even the resources to properly understand and know that this is good for me, it's not there. So that's a big challenge for you. How then do we get, people who, sometimes you need to save them from themselves. Maybe because they've been denied opportunity, not because he's naturally dumb, but he's been denied quality education. And you bring your policies, how do they, team up so that we make this work?
Well, I mean, like she rightly pointed out, there's the issue, the gap between the planning, the implementation or lack thereof, and the effort to correct those glaring gaps. So, for example, you find that given your educational system as it is, you have a situation where your people are not reading. So the enrollment may be high, but in effect what is coming out is poor. So quality is an issue. Now that's the whole thing about monitoring and evaluation. You assess what are the binding constraints, what is causing these problems. You identify them. If it is a question of the curriculum itself, the quality of the teachers, those are the issues that then should inform corrective policy making. Now, first of all, there has to be an acknowledgement that this is a problem and a willingness to put the money, invest those resources in addressing those issues. So that is an issue. So the finance ministries and the planning must be in sync. Now, institutionally, what you find in countries have experimented with separating finance from planning, then they marry them and then they divorce. With the creation of what they call the medium-term expenditure framework, we collapsed capital spending with the recurrent budget on the one to sort of, the idea was to say, well, we don't want to have these separate issues. We want to focus on dealing with recurrent issues and capital expenditures. By capital expenditures, I mean, building schools, recurrent expenditures, say, for example, paying wages, fees. And what you tend to have is sometimes that the planning ministries have the plans and ideas, but they don't have the resources. The finance ministries will say, well, they tend to be caught up in the imperatives of the short-run financial situations. I think that it would make sense, and of course this assumes that the capacities of both institutions exist, to once again go back to this separating those budgets, where the give planning the money to plan and to execute the part of the plan that is longer term, because the finance ministry should focus on the shorter term imperatives. But of course, this assumes that the institutions are working well. But it comes back to the whole point of accountability again. So even if the planning commission has these resources, and it should be able to be assessed to see whether, okay, given the money that you have you delivered? If you haven't delivered, what is your plan to ensure that things get done? But I think that part of that whole process should be also to give them that power of the purse as well.
If I can come in, I think that kind of hand in hand is with accountability is also what we have been stressing in this conference, the role of the active citizen. I think that people or institutions won't change what they're doing just because they wake up one day and they decide to change. In a lot of places it's because things are demanded, so you have an active citizenry which is making demands on government, which is monitoring what is going on, and that is how accountability gets effected. But if you have a situation where anything government does is regarded as a favor rather than the responsibility, then the accountabilities are warped, and we really need to re-examine the concept of citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen? Is a citizen somebody who just goes to vote every 4 years? What does active citizenship entail? How can citizens be empowered, both to really monitor how their institutions perform and also to make demands of their governments?
Linked to that is also the issue of decentralization. I mean, when you bring government and jurisdictions closer to the community, the presumption is that they are better able to see what the communities are doing those jurisdictions are doing for them, and to also be able to hold them accountable. But we need to move towards fiscal decentralization, where that whole accountability mechanism needs to be strengthened in that context. But we do have this decentralization in Ghana, for example, and the question is, how do we strengthen those systems to make them all work better?
Let me come to Professor Teshua. Because of your line of work, statistics will be crucial for you. But here we are, I don't know, not as a continent as a whole, we have no regards to statistics. The last time we did a work census was 2010. I hear Botswana's one was 2006. Last time they did a work census to find out who is in work and who's not in work. So, and you need these figures to make plans to project for the future. And so you're probably doing guesswork. How do we bring this culture also that, look, for us to move forward, we need the numbers, who's working, who's ill, who gave birth, who's Muslim, who's Christian, so that I can deliver.
Precisely. I think that the conference, yesterday afternoon we had a statistician general of South Africa who made a presentation about, what he called it going beyond the average, and it's about statistics, the importance of statistics. You were talking about countries that have not had censuses since 2006. There is one country in Africa that has not had a census since independence, So clearly, we do need data, and reliable and timely data. And it is something that the ECA is very concerned about. We do have an African Center for Statistics, which is liaising with national statistical offices, It's involved. It's involved with them, and in fact, our Africa Center for Statistics has just been made the depository for all national censuses in Africa. So we are very concerned with that. And one of the things, we have 5 sub-regional offices for North Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, East and Southern Africa, and the sub-regional offices. They are preparing these country profiles, and to do that they need to liaise with national statistical offices, because there is also a sensitivity with government. If you don't use government statistics, even when they don't exist, you get into trouble. So we recognize the importance of statistics, but we recognize the importance of accurate statistics. One of the problems with statistics is that you may have a census all right, but apart from just telling us how many people there are, we don't properly analyze the census. If we take the case of Ghana, it's only the 1960 census that was fully analyzed. Okay, the other, because they have so many volumes on all kinds of things, 1970 census, and then after 1970 there was no census until 1984. Then we had to wait for 2000 and then the 2010. So in terms of, as far as African countries go, we are timely. But the problem is that there is so much information from the censuses. And one of the things that the ECA is going to be doing soon, there's a project about telling stories with census, because there is so much data in there. We need to mine it. And yesterday, you should have been here, the Statistician General of South Africa. He calls it data mining, and how it allows you to even tell the profile of criminals in a community. Wow. So, but the point is that to do that, you need to invest in your statistical services. You need to invest in training, in the tools. We live in countries where if money does not come from somewhere, we don't conduct our censuses. So if you think that something is important, you allocate money for it. And I think that we need to really understand the power of information, the power of data, and make sure that we fund these studies regularly. Like you're saying, and one of the problems is also the definition. We were talking about it. If you look at unemployment statistics in Africa, you will find very low figures. Why? You know what the definition of employment or unemployment is? He is the economist. He will tell you. If you work for 1 hour
a week.
a week, you are deemed to be employed. Can you believe it? If you work for 1 hour a week, you are deemed to be employed. So this mass, you know, if you are only selling a bowl of granules, they ask you, they will take that you are employed. You know, and yet we know that so many people are underemployed, you know, and this is also contributing to the inequality. Because if you really want to deal with inequality, if you want to deal with social protection, the best social protection is a job. The best social protection is a job. That is what separates all of us from the destitute in society. If you didn't have a job, it wouldn't matter how handsome you are, how tall you are, what your desires are. At the end of the month, you don't get a wage. So the best form of social protection is a job. Mind you, it has to be a decent job. If it is not a decent job, then your social protection is weak, because it means that when you are ill, nobody is there to look after you. If you don't go to work, you don't get any money. But if you have like the ILO concept of a decent job, if you do have a decent job, you don't need, your father doesn't need to be rich, you don't need somebody. You can work your way out. Yes, you know, yeah.
Well, folks, that's all time would allow us in this interesting conversation. And as I say, tomorrow we'll be back to do it all over again. Thanks for watching.